The bond settled not like a whisper, but like the fall of a headsman's axe. It was a moment of absolute, soul-cleaving certainty that struck King Theron of the Evernite court in the center of his ancient, unbeating heart. For 1,000 years, he had been a monolith, a creature of obsidian will and unyielding control. Now, in the hollow silence of his own throne room, that control fractured. The source of the cataclysm was a girl. A human girl, brought before him as part of the annual tithe, her wrists bound in silken cords, her head bowed not in fear, but in a kind of patient observation. He had felt the first tremor as she crossed the threshold, a faint hum against the marble of his existence. He'd dismissed it. But as she was forced to her knees before the dais, her face lifted into the cold, silver light of the enchanted sconces, the hum became a roar. The fates, those cruel and capricious weavers, had finally presented him with his mate. His one, true counterpart in all of creation. The other half of his soul, forged to complete him. And she was broken. The realization was a shard of ice in his gut. He saw it in the way her eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, moved with a frantic intelligence that her lips did not. He saw it in the way the guards spoke about her, not to her. He saw it when his chancellor, a desiccated vampire named Lord Valerus, stepped forward and announced her with a sneer sheathed in courtly language. "Your Majesty, we present the final offering from the sunlit lands. Ilara of the Grey Hills. There is a complication. The girl is a mute. Mute." The word echoed in the cavernous space, a pronouncement of lack, of deficiency. A king whose voice could command armies, shatter stone, and bend the will of lesser creatures was meant to be bound to a creature of silence. A queen for the Evernite court who could not speak its decrees, who could not whisper counsel, who could not scream his name in the throes of passion or pain. It was an insult. A cosmic joke with his immortal life as the punchline. The bond, however, did not care for politics or propriety. It surged through him, a tidal wave of pure, agonizing connection. It screamed at him to go to her, to tear the cords from her wrists, to lift her into his arms and feel the frantic pulse of her living heart against his dead one. It showed him visions of a future, her hands in his, her laughter echoing in the halls, a sound he now knew he would never hear, her warmth a constant sun in his perpetual twilight. The longing was so profound it was a physical agony, a hollowing out of his chest that left him breathless. He watched her. She did not flinch under his scrutiny. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. Her hands, small and pale, were restless at her sides. They moved in a subtle, intricate dance, fingers weaving patterns in the air that seemed to speak a language all their own. A flicker of a thumb, a curl of a finger, it was a silent torrent of expression that he could not comprehend. It was noise he could not hear, and it infuriated him. "She is defective," Theron heard himself say, his voice a low thunder that made the very stones vibrate. The words tasted like ash. Each syllable was a betrayal of the screaming instinct inside him, a concession to the 1,000 years of pride and expectation that defined his reign. Valerus smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "Precisely, my king. Unfit. An unfortunate error on the part of destiny." Theron's gaze snapped to Ilara. He willed her to weep, to show fear, to crumble under the weight of his pronouncement. He needed her to be weak to justify the violence he was about to do to his own soul. But she did not. Her chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Her hands stilled. Her sea-grey eyes met his, and in their depths, he saw not despair, but a profound and shattering disappointment. It was not the disappointment of a subject before her king, but of an equal who had expected better. That look sealed her fate, and his. It was a challenge to his authority, to the very foundation of his world. A world where power was spoken, where command was heard, where strength was measured in volume. Her silence was not an absence, it was a fortress, and he was standing on the outside. "The bond is a lie," he declared, rising from his throne. The court held its collective, silent breath. The air grew thick, cold. "The fates are fallible. I will not be shackled to a floor. I reject this union." He felt the bond tear. It was not a clean break, but a ragged, brutal ripping of spiritual flesh. A scream echoed in the space between their minds, a sound of pure agony that was his and hers and something more ancient than both of them. His knees nearly buckled. He gripped the arm of his throne, knuckles turning white, the stone groaning under the pressure. Across the room, Ilara gasped, a small, sharp intake of air that was the only sound she had made. Her hands flew to her chest, her face paling to the color of bone. For the first time, he saw a crack in her composure. He saw the pain. And a cruel, desperate part of him rejoiced in it. "Take her away," he commanded, his voice hoarse. "To the archives. Let her be forgotten among the dust and the forgotten words she cannot even speak." The guards moved, their armor clattering in the ringing silence. They pulled her to her feet. As they led her from the throne room, she looked back at him one last time. Her hands lifted, and with deliberate, graceful movements, she formed a sign. A closed fist over her heart, then opened, palm flat, pushing the gesture away from her body. It was an act of offering and release, of severance. A clear, silent statement he could not translate but understood in his marrow. It was not a plea. It was a judgment. Then she was gone. The great doors boomed shut, and Theron was left alone on his throne, with the cheers of his sycophantic court ringing in his ears and the gaping, bleeding wound in his soul where half of his existence used to be. The silence she left behind was louder, more profound, and more terrifying than any scream. He had chosen power over connection, pride over destiny. He had made his pronouncement, and now, in the echoing stillness of his victory, the long, slow process of his own damnation could begin. The days that followed the rejection were a study in hollow pageantry. Theron sat on his throne, presided over his court, and felt nothing but the phantom ache of the sundered bond. It was a constant, low-grade torment, like a string on a lute pulled so taut it hummed with the threat of snapping. He found himself seeking noise, filling his halls with musicians and petitioners, anything to drown out the profound silence that had taken root in his mind. But it was no use. The silence had a texture, a weight. It was shaped like a human girl with storm-grey eyes. He had sent her to the royal archives, a place that was less a library and more a tomb for paper. It was a sprawling, neglected labyrinth beneath the castle, where forgotten treaties, failed prophecies, and the histories of fallen houses went to crumble into dust. It was a place of ultimate irrelevance, presided over by a single, ancient vampire named Kale, who had long ago lost the favor of the court and was himself a forgotten relic. It was a sentence of slow erasure, a merciful cruelty designed to make her disappear without the messiness of an execution. Theron had told himself it was a kindness. He now understood it was an act of profound cowardice. He expected reports of her decline. He envisioned her weeping in the dusty dark, her spirit eroding with the decaying parchment, her silent world collapsing into madness. He waited for Kale to send word that the human girl had wasted away from grief, that the broken bond had consumed her. That would be the proof he needed. Proof that she was too weak, too fragile. Proof that his decision had been a king's decision, hard, necessary, correct. The first report came after a week. It was delivered by a nervous young page who stammered that the archivist sent his respects and an update on his new assistant. "She is well, Your Majesty," the boy squeaked. Theron narrowed his eyes. "Well? Define well." "She eats what is brought to her. She sleeps." The archivist reports she has begun to organize the West Wing scrolls, which have not been touched in 3 centuries. Organizing. The word was so mundane, so contrary to the tragic, romantic decay he had imagined. It was a splinter under his nail. He dismissed the page with a wave of his hand, the phantom pain in his chest flaring with irritation. It was a fluke. A temporary surge of defiance before the inevitable despair set in. 3 weeks later, another report arrived, this time a written message from Kale himself, delivered with the evening meal. The script was a dry, spidery crawl, the words precise and academic. "The girl, Ilara, has demonstrated a remarkable aptitude for cataloging. She has devised a new system of cross-referencing based on symbolic association, rather than phonetics. It is, I must confess, vastly more efficient. Her presence has brought a measure of order to the chaos I have long presided over. Her silence is not one of emptiness, but of focus. She is, surprisingly content. Content. The word was a slap. He reread the note, the parchment crinkling in his tightening fist. Contentment was not supposed to be part of this equation. Despair, loneliness, a desperate yearning for the half of her soul he had denied her, that was what the bond severance was meant to inflict. He felt it every moment of his waking existence, a chasm that no amount of power or pleasure could fill. How could she not? How could she be content in that dusty tomb, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten words? He began to seek out the reports. He commanded Kale to send them daily. They became the focal point of his unending nights, a ritual of self-inflicted torture. The dispatches were infuriatingly simple, maddeningly serene. Ilara cleared the mold from the prophetic texts of the Second Age. She used lemon oil and a soft cloth. Ilara discovered a discrepancy in the lineage of the House of Morgan. She corrected it with a carefully penned note in the margin. Ilara has begun tending to the phosphorescent moss that grows in the lower vaults. She seems to find its silent light pleasing. He was the king of the Evernight, a creature of immense power and influence, and he spent his nights reading about moss and filing systems. It was absurd. It was maddening. He started to see her everywhere. In the quiet diligence of a servant polishing silver. In the focused frown of a strategist poring over a map. He saw her in every act of quiet competence, and it gnawed at him. He had dismissed her as a flaw, an absence, a lack. But her life, as described in Kale's dry reports, was one of purpose and creation. She was not merely surviving his rejection, she was building a world without him, a world of silent order and gentle light, a world in which he had no place. The visions started a month after she was gone. At first, they were fleeting. A glimpse of her hands, pale and slim, turning the brittle page of a book in the reflection of his wine glass. The scent of old paper and lemon oil on the cold night air in his chambers. Then they grew stronger. He would be in the middle of a council meeting, the drone of Valerus's voice fading into a meaningless buzz, and suddenly he would be in the archives. He could feel the cool, still air, see the motes of dust dancing in the single shaft of moonlight from a high grate. He would see her, back to him, her dark hair braided down her back, her shoulders set with a focus that was absolute. He would see her hands move, a flash of white in the gloom, signing to Kale, who would nod slowly, a rare, gentle smile on his desiccated face. They had a language. A secret, silent language he was not privy to. The old vampire, the forgotten one, was being granted the access that he, the king, had thrown away. The jealousy was a hot, living thing inside his chest, a dragon coiling in the empty space where the bond used to be. He had the power to command her presence, to drag her back to the throne room and force her to kneel. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that he could command her body, but he could not command her spirit. He could not make her look at him with anything but that profound, quiet disappointment. He had cast her into the darkness, expecting her to be extinguished. Instead, she had learned to coax light from the moss on the stones. She was thriving. And Theron, in his opulent, gilded cage, surrounded by the sounds of his own power, was beginning to lose his mind. The archives became Ilara's sanctuary. The silence that Theron had intended as a punishment was, to her, a balm. The world outside had always been a cacophony of sounds she could perceive as vibrations but could not shape with her own throat, a constant barrage of expectations she could never meet. People's faces were a landscape of impatience, their moving lips a reminder of her otherness. They saw her silence and assumed it was an absence of thought, a void. They spoke louder, slower, as if she were a simpleton. They never looked at her hands. But here, in the deep, quiet heart of the castle, the silence was a presence, not an absence. It was filled with the gentle rustle of vellum, the scent of dust and time, the steady, patient rhythm of her own breathing. Here, her thoughts could stretch, unfurl, and take root. The endless shelves were not a prison, they were a forest of knowledge, and she was its sole, dedicated explorer. Kale, the archivist, was a creature carved from shadow and parchment. His skin was as thin and dry as an ancient scroll, his movements slow and deliberate. When Theron had first cast her down here, Kale had regarded her with a weary, academic curiosity, another forgotten artifact to be shelved and ignored. He had set a cot for her in a small, dry alcove, provided her with food and water, and then retreated into his own dusty solitude. For the first few days, they existed in parallel orbits, two silent bodies moving through the labyrinthine halls. Ilara did not try to engage him. She simply began to work. She found a section of scrolls so thoroughly mildewed they had fused into a solid, unreadable mass. With painstaking care, she began to separate them, using a small, sharp knife and the warmth of her own living hands to coax the brittle pages apart. It was slow, meticulous work, requiring a patience that the rushed, noisy world above had never allowed her. It was on the fourth day that Kale first truly saw her. He had been observing her from the shadows of a towering bookshelf, watching her small, determined hands. She had successfully saved a scroll and was now carefully transcribing its faded, crumbling text onto fresh parchment. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her entire being focused on this single act of preservation. He stepped forward, his voice a dry rasp. "What does it say?" She looked up, startled. His voice was a strange intrusion, a rock dropped into a still pool. She met his gaze, then looked down at the scroll. Her hands rose. It was a hesitant gesture at first, cautious. She signed the words slowly, her fingers shaping the elegant, archaic forms of the old court sign. "It is a history of the Starfall Guild, weavers who charted the constellations in their tapestries." Kale blinked. His own hands, gnarled with age, lifted automatically, forming a clumsy, long-forgotten response. "You know the old tongue?" A small, surprised smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of caution. "My grandmother taught me." She said words spoken can lie, but the words of the hands must be true. It was the beginning. Their silent conversations became the new rhythm of the archives. Kale, who had not used the old tongue in 500 years, found the language returning to him like a half-remembered song. He learned the nuances of her expression, the way a slight dip of her chin added gravity to a statement, the way a quick flash of her fingers conveyed a dry wit he never would have expected. He saw that her mind was sharp, her intellect keen. She was not a broken thing, she was a complete person who simply spoke a different language. He began to teach her, in turn. He showed her how to bind books, how to mix inks, how to read the subtle tells of a forged document. She absorbed it all with a hunger that astonished him. She was not just organizing the chaos of the archives, she was mastering it. The space began to transform under her care. The air grew less stale, tinged with the scent of her lemon oil polish and the fresh ink she ground herself. She arranged the phosphorescent moss in patterns on the damp stone walls of the lower levels, creating soft, glowing murals of constellations, echoing the work of the Starfall Guild she so admired. The archives, once a place of decay, began to feel alive. For Ilara, this was more than survival. It was a reclamation. In the world above, she had been defined by what she lacked. Here, she was defined by what she created. Her worth was measured in the straightness of a shelf of books, the clarity of a transcribed passage, the quiet, shared understanding with the old vampire who had become her friend. The ache of the broken bond was a constant companion, a hollow space beneath her ribs. Some nights, it was a sharp, stabbing pain that made her gasp in the darkness. She would feel a phantom echo of Theron's rage, his frustration, his gnawing loneliness. She understood that he was suffering, but her pity was a distant, clinical thing. He had been given a choice, to see her or to see a symbol of his own perceived imperfection. He had chosen the latter. The pain was the consequence of his own blindness. She would not let it consume her. Instead, she poured her energy, her focus, her very essence into the world she was building. She found a forgotten treatise on architecture and, using its principles, designed a system of pulleys and counterweights to more easily move the heaviest tomes. She discovered a collection of folk songs from the mountain villages, their lyrics full of a simple, earthy wisdom, and she began illustrating them in the margins of a blank ledger. One evening, Kale found her in her alcove, not reading, but staring at her own hands in the soft moss light. "What are you thinking?" He signed. She looked at him, her grey eyes luminous. "He called me defective," she signed back, her movements slow, deliberate. "He said I was a flaw." He looked at my silence and saw an empty room. She paused, then her hands moved again, faster now, imbued with a fierce, quiet passion. But this room is not empty. It is furnished with everything I have ever learned, everything I have ever felt. He did not bother to open the door. Cale watched her, his ancient heart stirring with a protective instinct he hadn't felt in centuries. He had seen countless kings and queens rise and fall. He knew the corrosive nature of pride. Theron had thrown away a treasure, and he was so blinded by its unusual shape that he didn't even know what he had lost. But Cale knew. And he knew that the quiet, resilient girl before him was building a kingdom of her own in the dust, a kingdom far stronger than the one of pomp and circumstance in the world above. Theron's control, the bedrock of his millennium-long reign, was eroding like a cliff face under a relentless tide. The daily reports from the archives were no longer a source of irritated curiosity, they were an addiction. Each detail of Alara's quiet, productive life was a fresh torment. He pictured her hands, not bound in silk, but dusted with the powder of ancient paper, stained with the rich, dark ink she mixed herself. He imagined the scent of the lemon oil she used to polish the wood, a clean, bright scent so at odds with the cloying incense that filled his throne room. His court began to notice the change in him. His legendary composure had developed cracks. He was prone to sudden, unnerving silences in the middle of council meetings, his eyes focused on something no one else could see. His temper, always a cold and precise instrument, was becoming volatile and unpredictable. He shattered a priceless obsidian goblet when a courtier made an offhand remark about the virtue of a quiet wife. The man was banished to the frozen northern garrisons before the wine had even finished seeping into the marble floor. Lord Valerus watched these developments with the keen, predatory interest of a vulture circling a dying beast. He saw the king's distraction, the haunted look that sometimes flickered in his eyes. He attributed it to the lingering insult of the broken bond, a weakness that needed to be managed. "Your Majesty," he would say, his voice a soothing, venomous balm, "you were right to cast the defective thing aside. Such a flaw would have been a poison to your legacy. Your strength is in your purity, your wholeness." But Theron no longer felt whole. He felt amputated. The visions were growing more frequent, more vivid. He would be walking the battlements, the cold wind whipping his cloak around him, and for a moment, he would feel the cool, still air of the archives. He would see Alara, not as a distant figure, but up close. He could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the way a loose strand of her dark hair curled at her temple. He saw her smile, a genuine, unguarded smile, as she shared a silent joke with Cale. The sight of it was like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. She had never smiled for him. He had never given her a reason to. One night, the loneliness became unbearable. It was a physical presence in his vast, empty chambers, a cold weight on his chest. He stood before a grand, silver-framed mirror, but his own reflection seemed distant, unreal. As he stared, his image flickered. For a heartbeat, he saw her standing behind him, her reflection watching his with those serious, sea-grey eyes. He spun around, his heart, that useless, dead muscle, lurching with a desperate hope. The room was empty. The silence mocked him. He was the king. He could have anything he desired. Any woman, any treasure, any power. And the only thing he wanted was the one thing he had willfully discarded. The irony was so bitter it felt like poison on his tongue. He had rejected her for her silence, and now her silence was the only thing he could hear. It was the silence of his empty bed, the silence of his hollow triumphs, the silence of a soul that had severed its other half. Meanwhile, in the quiet world below, Alara was making a discovery. It began with a discrepancy, a single line in a royal genealogy that didn't match the record in a corresponding trade agreement. It was a small thing, a clerical error most would have overlooked. But Alara's mind, honed by the meticulous order of the archives, snagged on it. She followed the thread. For weeks, she delved deeper, cross-referencing shipping manifests, private letters, and forgotten court records. Cale, intrigued by her focus, helped her, retrieving heavy, dust-choked ledgers from the highest shelves. What she uncovered was not a simple mistake. It was a deliberate, carefully constructed lie woven into the very fabric of the kingdom's history. A century ago, Theron's grandfather had usurped the throne from his older brother. The official histories recorded that the brother, Prince Lyran, had died of a wasting sickness. But Alara found the truth hidden in the private correspondence of the court physician. Prince Lyran had not been sick. He had been exiled. And the reason for his exile, the justification for the coup, was a secret that made the breath catch in Alara's throat. Prince Lyran had taken a mate who was a member of the Sun Singers, a nomadic human tribe who communicated not through speech, but through a complex song language. He had been declared unfit to rule because he had bound himself to someone considered incomplete, someone who could not speak the court tongue. The pattern was undeniable. It was a prejudice codified into law and history, a systemic rejection of any form of communication that wasn't verbal. Her own rejection was not a personal whim of Theron's. It was the inevitable outcome of a system of power built on a narrow, arrogant definition of what it meant to be whole. She found a portrait of Prince Lyran, hidden in a dusty folio. He had the same dark hair as Theron, the same strong jawline, but his eyes were different. They were kind. Beside his portrait was a smaller, more delicate sketch of his mate, a woman with long, flowing hair and a serene expression. Her name was Lyra. Beneath the sketch, the artist had written a single, damning note. Her silence was mistaken for emptiness, but in truth, it was a vessel for a music our court was too deaf to hear. Alara traced the words with her fingertip. In that moment, her pain, her sense of personal injury, coalesced into something larger, colder, and far more powerful, a profound and unyielding sense of justice. She was not just a rejected mate. She was the latest victim in a long line of silenced voices. She looked up at Cale, her hands moving with a new, sharp certainty. He did not just reject me, she signed. He rejected a part of his own history. And I am going to make him read it. The king's descent into obsession was swift and total. He could no longer bear the second-hand reports. He needed to see her for himself. He needed to witness her misery, to confirm the narrative he had constructed in his own mind, that she was broken, lost, and desperate without him. Only then, perhaps, could the phantom ache in his soul be soothed. He announced a formal inspection of the royal archives, a decree that sent a ripple of confusion through the court. The archives had not been graced by a royal visit in over 400 years. Valerus was immediately suspicious. Your Majesty, there is nothing there but dust and decay. It is beneath your station. Allow me to go in your stead. No, Theron snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. I will go myself. I wish to assess the state of our kingdom's historical records. It is a king's duty. The lie felt thin and brittle, even to him. His duty had nothing to do with it. This was a pilgrimage to the site of his own self-inflicted wound. He descended the long, winding stone staircase into the depths of the castle, the air growing cooler, thicker with the scent of old paper and damp earth. The flickering torchlight of his guards cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the shelves of books look like the teeth of some great, sleeping beast. He remembered this place from his youth, a dark, forgotten corner of the castle, a place of endings. But the archives he entered were not the ones he remembered. The oppressive gloom had been lessened. Soft, ethereal light emanated from intricate patterns of phosphorescent moss along the walls, casting a gentle, blue-green glow over the main chamber. The air, while still ancient, was clean, free of the choking dust he'd expected. There was a sense of order, of purpose. It was not a tomb. It was a sanctuary. And then he saw her. She was standing at a large wooden lectern in the center of the chamber, bathed in the soft moss light. She was not in rags, nor was she weeping. She wore a simple, clean tunic, her dark hair neatly braided. Her back was to him, her posture straight and focused as she carefully inked a line of text onto a fresh sheet of parchment. Cale stood beside her, his gnarled hand pointing to a passage in the open book before them. As Theron watched, hidden in the shadows of the entrance, Alara finished her line of text, put down her quill, and turned to Cale. Her hands lifted, moving in a fluid, articulate dance. The moss light caught on her fingers, making them seem to glow. It was a conversation, vibrant and alive, happening in a silence so profound it seemed to press in on Theron from all sides. Cale responded with a slow, deliberate sign, and Ilara's lips curved into that small, private smile Theron had only ever seen in his tormented visions. It was a smile of shared understanding, of easy camaraderie. The sight of it ignited the dragon of jealousy in his chest. That smile should have been his. That understanding should have been his. He had been so certain of her desolation, but what he found was a world complete without him. A world where she was not only surviving but thriving. A world where she was seen, understood, and valued. He stepped out of the shadows. The sound of his boots on the stone floor was a violent intrusion. Cale looked up, his eyes widening in alarm. He bowed low, a creak of ancient joints. "Your Majesty. We were not expecting you." Ilara turned. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by a cool, unreadable calm. Her sea-grey eyes met his, and he felt the jolt of their connection, the raw, frayed edges of the broken bond scraping against each other. There was no fear in her gaze. No pleading. There was only that same, quiet disappointment he remembered from the throne room, now honed to a razor's edge. He strode forward, his royal authority his only shield against the profound vulnerability he felt. "I have come to inspect the state of the archives," he announced, his voice booming in the enclosed space, sounding harsh and alien in the stillness. He looked at the work on her lectern, the perfectly transcribed page, the elegant, steady script. "You have been busy." It was meant to sound like an accusation, a judgment on her audacity to find purpose in her exile. She did not flinch. She simply looked at him, waiting. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to demand that she feel the same gaping emptiness that was devouring him. "Have you nothing to say?" he finally snapped respectively, the words dripping with a cruel irony that tasted like acid. Her hands lifted. Slowly, deliberately, she made a single sign. A hand held flat, palm down, sweeping across her body as if to indicate the entire chamber. Then, her fingers came together, pointing toward him, followed by a gesture that was unmistakably a question. "Is this what you expected?" He did not know the language of her hands, but the meaning was as clear as a shout in the stillness. It was not a question of a subject to her king. It was a challenge. A demand for him to confront the chasm between his arrogant assumptions and the reality before him. He saw in that simple gesture the totality of his failure. He had expected a ruin, and he had found a garden. He had expected a broken bird, and he had found a queen in a kingdom of silence. He had no answer. The power of his voice, the weight of his crown, the might of his kingdom, all of it was meaningless in the face of that silent, devastating question. He was the one who was lacking. He was the one who could not understand. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode from the archives, the sound of his own retreating footsteps echoing his defeat. He fled the quiet order she had created, returning to the noise and chaos of his court, but the silence followed him. It was no longer an absence. It was her presence, a constant, reproachful reminder of the world he was not welcome in, the language he could not speak, and the woman he had been too blind to see. The retreat from the archives was a rout. Theron didn't just walk away, he fled, pursued by the ghost of a silent question. Back in the familiar grandeur of his chambers, the marble felt cold and hostile, the silken tapestries seemed to mock him with their voiceless narratives. He had gone down into that dusty world expecting to confirm his own strength and her weakness, and had instead been handed a mirror that showed him nothing but his own colossal ignorance. Her contentment was not a passive state, it was an active creation. Her silence was not an emptiness, it was a language. He had judged the entirety of her being on the single metric his arrogance valued, the spoken word, and had found her wanting. The universe was now showing him, with excruciating patience, that he was the one who had failed the test. The realization settled in his chest, a cold, heavy stone. The jealousy and rage that had fueled him began to curdle into something else, something far more terrifying: shame. It was a foreign emotion to him, a bitter pill for a king who had never once in his 1,000-year life had cause to doubt his own judgment. He had dismissed her as a flaw. But what was a king who could not understand the language of half his own soul? What was a ruler who was deaf to an entire world of communication that existed just beyond the reach of his own ears? He was the one who was defective. He was the one who was incomplete. This thought, this single, revolutionary idea, broke through the fortress of his pride. It was the beginning of a profound and painful shift. He could continue on his current path, rattling around in his gilded cage, growing more bitter and isolated, a king haunted by a ghost of his own making. Or he could do the one thing he had never done before. He could learn. The decision was not a conscious one. It was a primal instinct, the desperate act of a drowning man reaching for a rope. That night, he did not summon his council or his courtesans. He went to his personal library, a place he hadn't visited in decades, and began to search. He tore through scrolls on diplomacy, on warfare, on ancient lineage, until finally, in a locked chest in the farthest corner, he found what he was looking for: a series of slim volumes bound in worn leather, treatises on the so-called lesser tongues of the continent. And there, tucked between a primer on the smoke signals of the mountain clans and the drum language of the marshfolk, was a book titled An Introduction to the Old Court Sign. He opened it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded. It was filled with delicate drawings of hands, fingers curled, palms open, wrists turned. It was the language she had spoken with Kale. The language she had used to ask her devastating question. He sat down, the book open before him, and began to read. It was like learning to breathe again. The grammar was complex, the syntax alien. Each sign was not just a word, but a concept, modified by the speed of the gesture, its placement in space, the expression on the signer's face. It was a language of breathtaking nuance and elegance. His first attempts were clumsy, insulting. His fingers, accustomed to gripping a sword hilt or a royal scepter, felt thick and stupid. He tried to form the sign for hello, a simple, open-palmed wave from the forehead, and felt like a fool. He practiced for hours, alone in his chambers, the silence broken only by the rustle of the page and his own frustrated sighs. He was a king, reduced to the status of a struggling schoolboy. And yet, for the first time in months, the gnawing ache of the bond lessened. It was still there, a hollow void, but now there was a flicker of something new in its place, a fragile, terrifying tendril of hope. He was building a bridge, one clumsy gesture at a time, across the chasm of his own making. While Theron was taking his first faltering steps into her world, Ilara was expanding her own. Her discovery of Prince Lyran and his silenced mate had given her a new sense of purpose. She was no longer just an archivist, she was a historian, uncovering a truth that had been deliberately buried. Her quiet competence and gentle nature had not gone unnoticed by the castle's other forgotten souls. The servants who brought her meals, initially wary, had grown to respect her. They were used to the arrogance and casual cruelty of the vampires they served. Ilara was different. She always met their eyes. She would offer a small, grateful nod. One day, a young kitchen maid named Anya lingered after leaving the food tray. Hesitantly, she mimed stirring a pot and pointed to the soup, raising her eyebrows in a question. Ilara smiled and made the sign for delicious. Anya's face broke into a wide, relieved grin. Soon, others began to communicate with her in their own makeshift ways. A stable hand would bring her a strange, beautiful feather he'd found. A laundress would leave a small, sweet-smelling flower on her meal tray. They were small gestures of connection, a community of the overlooked forming around her. They saw her not as the king's silent shame, but as one of their own, someone who existed in the margins, whose worth was not recognized by those in power. They became her eyes and ears. They brought her whispers from the court above of the king's strange moods, his sudden rages, his growing isolation. They told her about the courtier banished for a careless word, about the unease that was beginning to fester in the halls of power. Kale watched this silent network grow with a quiet approval. He helped Ilara, bringing her more records, more letters, more fragments of the story she was piecing together. He saw the fire in her, the resolve hardening in her gaze. She was not planning a rebellion of swords and banners, but something far more potent, a rebellion of truth. She was forging a weapon out of forgotten words and buried histories. One evening, she showed Kale the final piece of evidence she had uncovered, a secret addendum to the old law of royal succession. It stated that any heir who bound themselves to a mate deemed vocally incomplete would forfeit their claim to the throne. It was the legal mechanism used to disinherit Prince Lyran. It was the unwritten law that had condemned her. This is what he fears, she signed to Kale, her hands sharp and precise. Not me. Not my silence. He fears this. The loss of his crown. It is the foundation of his power, Kale signed back, his expression grim. A foundation built on a lie, she replied, her gaze meeting his, her eyes like chips of flint. And I am going to bring it down. She did not need a voice to start a revolution. She just needed the truth, and the courage to bring it into the light. Theron's obsession with the silent language, and by extension, with Alara, did not go unnoticed. His erratic behavior and self-imposed isolation were creating a power vacuum in the Evernite court, and nature, especially vampire nature, abhors a vacuum. Lord Valerus, ever the opportunist, saw the king's perceived weakness not as a sickness to be cured, but as an opportunity to be exploited. Valerus had been the most vocal proponent of Alara's rejection. He had framed it as an act of strength, a king purifying his line from a defective element. Now, he began to subtly reframe the narrative. The king's lingering distraction was no longer the aftershock of a wise decision, but a symptom of a deep-seated flaw. The human girl, the silent shame, had somehow infected the king's mind, a testament to her insidious, unnatural power. He moved through the court like a poison, whispering in the shadowed alcoves and gilded halls. "Have you seen the king?" he would murmur to a powerful duke. "His eyes are elsewhere. He neglects his duties. He is haunted by the mute girl. A king should not be so easily undone by a broken toy." To a formidable general, he would say, "The northern garrisons report unrest. The king has not reviewed the dispatch. His mind is occupied." A distracted king is a vulnerable king. And a vulnerable kingdom is a tempting prize for our enemies. He was careful, never overtly challenging Theron's authority. Instead, he planted seeds of doubt, nurturing the growing anxiety within the court. He presented himself as the loyal chancellor, the steady hand seeking only to protect the kingdom from its monarch's curious affliction. He used Alara as a symbol of everything that was wrong, a foreign contaminant that had weakened the pure, unyielding strength of the vampire throne. His whispers eventually reached Theron, as he knew they would. The king was too consumed by his private studies to engage in the usual courtly intrigue, a fact Valerus counted on. Theron heard the rumors of his own instability, of the court's growing concern, but he dismissed them as the predictable machinations of ambitious lesser beings. He failed to see how potent the narrative Valerus was weaving had become. He was learning Alara's language, but he was forgetting how to speak the language of power he had mastered centuries ago. Valerus knew he needed to escalate. The whispers were not enough. He needed to turn the symbol of Alara into a tangible threat, an infection that required a surgeon's knife to remove. He believed that if the source of the king's madness were eliminated, one of two things would happen. Either Theron would be shocked back to his senses, his mind cleared of the phantom limb that plagued him, or his final, definitive break from reality would prove him unfit to rule. Either outcome served Valerus's ambition. He summoned his personal guard, a cadre of ruthless vampires bound to him by blood oaths and promises of power. They were killers, not courtiers, and they moved through the castle's secret passages like wraiths. "The king is unwell," Valerus told them, his voice a low, conspiratorial hum in the darkness of his private chamber. "He is bewitched by the silent human in the archives. Her existence is a poison in the heart of our kingdom. For the good of the Evernite, this poison must be purged." He did not need to be more explicit. His guards understood. This was not to be a royal execution, but a quiet, unfortunate accident. A slip on the damp stairs. A tragic collapse of an unstable bookshelf. A human girl's fragile body was no match for the stone and shadows of the archives. Kale, the archivist, is old and irrelevant, Valerus added as a final instruction. But he is loyal to the king. Ensure he does not witness anything that might trouble his conscience. The implication was clear. Kale was as disposable as the girl. As his assassins slipped away into the castle's hidden veins, Valerus allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. He was not just eliminating a political inconvenience. He was, in his own mind, purifying the court. He was excising the weakness Theron had failed to properly destroy. He was asserting the old way, the true way of the Evernight, that power was absolute, that silence was emptiness, and that anything or anyone who defied that truth must be ground into dust. He had no concept of the bond, no understanding of the spiritual cataclysm he was about to unleash. He saw only a simple, political calculation, and in his arrogance, he believed he had accounted for every variable. He was wrong. The attack came just after moon high, the deepest point of the vampire night. The archives were still and quiet, bathed in the soft, blue-green glow of the moss Alara so carefully tended. She and Kale were working at the large central table, meticulously restoring a set of ancient celestial maps. The silence between them was comfortable, full of the easy rhythm of shared work. The first sign of trouble was a subtle shift in the air, a cold draft from a direction where no draft should be. Kale looked up, his ancient senses, though dulled by time, detecting a flicker of wrongness. He saw a shadow detach itself from the deeper darkness of a far corridor. Then another. "Alara," he rasped, his voice tight with sudden alarm. He shoved the heavy table, sending it scraping across the stone floor to create a makeshift barrier. "Behind me. Now." She didn't hesitate. She had seen the figures too, their movements too fluid, too predatory to be servants or scholars. There were 3 of them, clad in dark leather, their faces grim and impassive. They were Valerus's personal guard. She recognized their insignia from the court records she had studied. The lead vampire smiled, a flash of white fangs in the gloom. "The Chancellor sends his regards. He regrets that your time in the King's service has come to an end." Kale drew a long, thin letter opener from his belt. It was a pathetic weapon against trained killers, but he held it with the steady hand of one who had nothing left to lose. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice a low growl. The fight was brutal and short. The assassins were younger, stronger, faster. Kale was an archivist, not a warrior. But he fought with a desperate, paternal fury, his ancient body moving with a surprising speed. He managed to wound one of them, a deep gash in the arm, before the other 2 overwhelmed him. One of them drove a fist into his chest, the sound a sickening crack of old bone. Kale crumpled to the floor, gasping, the letter opener clattering away. At the same instant, hundreds of feet above in the royal tower, Theron screamed. It was not a sound of anger or command. It was a raw, animal cry of pure agony. The bond, the frayed and broken tether to Alara, had just erupted into a psychic firestorm. He felt a wave of terror so profound it dropped him to his knees, not his terror, but hers, flooding his senses, drowning him. It was the primal, heart-stopping fear of a cornered animal facing its end. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He moved. He burst from his chambers, a blur of shadow and fury, his guards scrambling to keep up. The courtiers in the halls flattened themselves against the walls as he passed, their faces masks of shock and fear. They had never seen their king like this, his control shattered, his eyes burning with a terrifying, crimson light. He was following the screaming thread of the bond, a beacon of her pain pulling him down, down, down into the castle's depths. Back in the archives, the lead assassin advanced on Alara. She was backed against a towering shelf of scrolls, her escape cut off. Kale was groaning on the floor, trying to rise. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, overwhelming silence. She was going to die here, in the quiet place she had made her own. But as the vampire reached for her, something shifted in her eyes. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by a surge of pure, defiant rage. She would not die a victim. She would not be erased. She grabbed a heavy, leather-bound book from the shelf beside her and swung it with all her might, catching the vampire square in the face. The impact was solid, satisfying. He staggered back, snarling, a dark bruise already forming on his pale cheek. It was a futile gesture, and she knew it. But it bought her a second. A second was all Theron needed. He exploded into the chamber like a force of nature. He was no longer a king, he was a wraith, a storm of vengeance. The assassins spun around, their eyes wide with shock at his sudden appearance. They had no time to react. Theron was on them, a whirlwind of motion. The fight was not a duel, it was a slaughter. He moved in slow-motion detail, each action precise, lethal. He broke the arm of the first with a sound like snapping wood. He drove his fist through the chest of the second, his expression a mask of cold fury. The third, the one she had hit, tried to flee. Theron was on him in an instant, lifting him off the ground by his throat. "Who sent you?" Theron's voice was preternaturally calm, a dead, flat sound more terrifying than any shout. The vampire choked, clawing at Theron's unyielding grip. "Valerus. Lord Valerus." Theron's eyes glowed. He squeezed, and there was a final, sharp crack. He dropped the body to the floor and the chamber fell silent, save for Cale's ragged breathing and the frantic beat of Alara's heart. Theron turned to her. His rage fell away, replaced by a raw, desperate panic. He saw the book clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. He saw the defiance in her eyes, warring with the fear. He saw her, alive, breathing, unharmed. The relief was so overwhelming it felt like a physical blow, nearly buckling his knees for the second time in his long life. He took a step toward her, then another. He was covered in the dust and blood of the fight. He looked like the monster from the old tales. He saw her flinch, a tiny, involuntary movement, and it stopped him cold. He was the reason for this. His rejection, his neglect, his blindness had led her here, to this moment of terror. He remembered the book. The hours spent tracing the shapes of her language with his clumsy fingers. He lifted a hand, slowly, so as not to frighten her. It trembled slightly. He formed a single, hesitant sign, the lines imperfect, the movement unsure. A hand tapping his own chest, then pointing to her. "You." It was meant to be the sign for "Are you safe?" but in his haste and desperation, it was incomplete. It was just a question. "You." But it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first word he had ever truly spoken to her in her own language. It was an acknowledgement. An attempt. A bridge. Alara stared at his hand, at the clumsy, desperate gesture. Her breath hitched. The book fell from her fingers, landing on the stone floor with a soft thud. In the midst of the carnage, surrounded by the bodies of her would-be assassins, the King of the Evernight had finally asked her a question she could understand. And in that moment, everything changed. The aftermath of the attack was a vortex of charged silence. Theron stood frozen, his hand still extended in its clumsy, questioning gesture. Alara stared at it, the frantic adrenaline in her veins slowly receding, leaving behind a shaky, profound stillness. He had spoken to her. Not with his powerful, booming voice, but with a language he had no reason to know. A language he had despised. Her gaze lifted from his hand to his face. The crimson rage was gone from his eyes, replaced by an emotion she had never seen there before, a raw, undisguised fear. He was afraid for her. The realization was as stunning as the attack itself. Breaking the tableau, she took a slow, deliberate step away from the bookshelf and went to Cale's side. The old vampire was struggling to sit up, clutching his chest. Alara knelt beside him, her hands moving in a quick, anxious flurry. "Are you hurt?" "Where?" Cale managed a weak smile, his own hands shaky as he answered. "My pride, mostly. And a few ribs that are older than this castle. I will mend." Theron watched them, a storm of emotions warring within him. He saw the genuine, tender concern she had for the old archivist. He saw the easy, fluent way they spoke, a world of communication he was only just beginning to comprehend. The shame from his first visit returned, tenfold. He had not only failed to see her, he had failed to protect her. His political blindness had almost gotten her killed. "Guards," he called, his voice hoarse. He did not turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on Alara. Two of his royal guards, who had arrived moments after the fight was over, stepped into the chamber, their faces pale at the sight of the carnage. "Take Lord Valerus to the deepest cell. He is to see no one. Speak to no one." He paused. "And send for the royal physician. See to the archivist." The guards, accustomed to his cold commands, were startled by the raw edge in his voice. They scurried to obey, helping Cale to his feet with a gentleness born of fear of their king's current state. Cale looked at Alara, a question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, telling him it was all right, that she would be safe. As they led Kale away, Theron and Ilara were left alone with the dead. The moss light seemed to cast a funerary pall over the room. The silence was no longer comfortable or challenging, it was heavy with unspoken things, with a history of pain and misunderstanding that lay between them like a vast, uncharted territory. "You cannot stay here," Theron said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "It is not safe." He expected her to argue, to show defiance. Instead, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, and waited. It was clear the next move was his. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the king decreeing the fate of a subject. He was a man facing the consequences of his actions, asking for something he had no right to expect. "Come with me," he said. It was not a command. It was a plea. He turned and began to walk toward the exit, not looking back to see if she would follow. It had to be her choice. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to sweep her into his arms and carry her to safety, to physically shield her from the world that had tried to harm her. But he knew that would be a violation, another act of possession from a man who had already taken too much. He had to give her the space to make her own decision. He walked through the darkened corridors, the sound of his own footsteps echoing his solitude. The ache of the bond was a sharp, throbbing pain, a desperate yearning for her proximity. For 100 agonizing paces, he heard no other sound. He had failed. She would not follow. She would choose her kingdom of silence over the man who had banished her to it. Then he heard it. A soft, light footfall on the stone behind him. Hesitant at first, then growing steadier, more certain. She was following him. The relief was so profound it almost brought him to his knees for a third time. He did not look back. He just kept walking, leading her out of the darkness of the archives and up the long, winding stairs toward the heart of the kingdom. He led her not to a guest chamber, or a gilded cell, but to his own private rooms. The royal suite was a vast, opulent space, filled with dark, polished wood, rich velvet hangings, and artifacts of his long reign. It was the center of his power, and it had never felt more like a prison. He dismissed the guards at the door, sealing the two of them inside. The contrast between them was stark. He, the ancient, powerful king, covered in the evidence of his violence. She, the small, silent human, her simple tunic standing out against the lavish backdrop, her presence a quiet challenge to everything the room represented. He finally turned to face her. He had brought her here for her safety, but now, alone with her, he felt a terror that had nothing to do with assassins. This was the true reckoning. He started, his voice failing him. Words, his greatest weapon, were useless now. He took a deep breath and did the hardest thing he had ever done. He laid down his weapon. He raised his hands, slowly, palms open to show he meant no harm. He looked into her storm-gray eyes, and he began to sign. His movements were still clumsy, halting. He had to pause, to think, to remember the shapes from the book. I was wrong. 4 simple signs that cost him more than 1,000 years of pride. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, caution. He pressed on, forcing his stiff fingers to obey, to speak the truth he had denied for so long. I saw flaw, weakness. He tapped his own temple. Blind. He pushed the sign away from his own face, a gesture of renunciation. You are not a flaw. Your world, he made a gesture to encompass her, her silence, her language, is not empty. I was the one who was empty. He lowered his hands, his shoulders slumping. He had laid himself bare. He had admitted his failure, his blindness, his profound, world-altering mistake. He stood before her, stripped of his crown, his authority, his pride. He was just Theron, the man who had broken the most precious thing he had ever been given, and he was asking, with the only language that mattered, for a chance to learn how to fix it. Ilara watched him. She watched the struggle in his hands, the concentration on his face, the raw, unshielded vulnerability in his eyes. Every clumsy gesture was a confession. Every hesitant sign was an apology. This was not the arrogant, cold-hearted king who had rejected her in front of his entire court. This was a man utterly, terrifyingly lost, trying to find his way back. She did not offer forgiveness. It was not hers to give so easily. The wound was too deep, the scar too fresh. But she saw the effort. She saw the change. He wasn't just trying to possess her, he was trying to understand her. And in the world she had always known, that was the rarest and most precious gift of all. Her own hands lifted. Her movements, in contrast to his, were fluid and sure. Words are easy, she signed, her expression serious. Even words spoken with the hands. He flinched, but nodded, accepting the truth of it. He waited. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. She told him of her life before the tithe, of the constant frustration, the loneliness of being unheard. She told him of the humiliation in the throne room, the tearing pain of the bond, the cold despair of her exile. She did not raise her voice, she had none to raise, but the force of her story, told in the stark, beautiful poetry of her signs, filled the room, silencing the ghosts of his own power. Then, her signs softened. She told him of the archives, of the peace she had found in the quiet order. She told him of Kale's kindness, of the joy of being understood, of building a world from the dust of what he had discarded. She showed him both the wound he had inflicted and the strength she had forged in spite of it. When she finished, she stood before him, her story hanging in the air between them. She had shown him everything. The choice was still his. He looked at her, his ancient heart aching with a millennium of regret packed into a few short months. He understood now. Love was not possession. It was not about finding a perfect reflection of oneself. It was about the slow, difficult, terrifying work of learning another person's language, of opening the door to their world and stepping inside, leaving your own crown at the threshold. His hands rose one last time, his movements more certain now, imbued with a conviction that came from the very core of his being. "Teach me," he signed. It was not a demand. It was a supplication. "Let me learn." Ilara held his gaze for a long, silent moment. She saw the truth in his eyes. The beginning of a long, arduous road. She gave a single, slow nod. An agreement. A contract. A beginning. She would teach him. And he, the king of the Evernight, would finally learn how to listen. The next morning, King Theron did something unprecedented. He convened the full Evernight court not in the grand throne room, but in the castle's central library, a vast, circular chamber lined with books from floor to ceiling. It was a place of knowledge, not just power, and the choice of venue sent a ripple of confusion and apprehension through the assembled nobility. They found their king standing on a low dais, but he was not alone. Beside him stood the human girl, the silent shame, no longer in a simple tunic but in a gown of deep midnight blue that matched the color of his own royal attire. She was not standing behind him or below him, but at his side, as an equal. Lord Valerus was not present, his absence was a thunderous statement. When the court had settled into a tense, whispering silence, Theron raised a hand. He began to speak, his voice carrying its usual authority, but there was a new timbre to it, a resonance of humility that no one had ever heard before. "For centuries," he began, his gaze sweeping over the sea of pale, aristocratic faces, "the strength of this court has been defined by the power of the spoken word. We have equated silence with weakness, with absence, with a lack of intelligence. We have built our laws, our traditions, and our very sense of superiority on this narrow, arrogant belief." He paused, letting the words sink in. He then turned his head slightly to look at Ilara, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "I have been the greatest proponent of this belief. And I have been profoundly, shamefully wrong." A collective gasp went through the room. A king admitting error was unheard of. Theron ignored it. He continued, his voice steady. "I rejected the mate the fates chose for me because I could not hear her voice. I was deaf to her language, and in my deafness, I called her the one who was flawed." He then did something that shattered every remaining precedent of the Evernight court. As he spoke his next words, his hands rose, mirroring his speech with the clear, deliberate movements of the old court sign. The dual-language proclamation was a revolution in itself. "This is Ilara. She is not a flaw. She is not my shame. She is my mate. My queen. And her language," he signed and spoke the words with equal emphasis, "is now the language of this court. He declared that tutors in the old court sign would be made available to all, and that fluency would be expected of any who wished to have the ear of the throne. He announced that the laws of succession, the very ones Alara had uncovered, were to be rewritten. The old prejudices, codified into law, were to be burned. It was a coup. A complete upending of their world, delivered not with a sword, but with a quiet, unassailable moral authority. Some of the older, more traditional vampires looked aghast. Others, the more pragmatic, were already calculating the political shift. But many, especially the younger generation, looked at Alara, at her quiet dignity, her unshakable composure, and then at their king, who was willingly making himself vulnerable for her, and they felt a stir of something new. Respect. Hope. When he finished, he did not ask for their assent. He simply stood beside Alara, a united front. In the ringing silence, Alara's hands lifted. She signed to the court, her movements graceful and certain. Theron, standing beside her, gave her words a voice for those who could not yet understand. A kingdom that listens with its eyes as well as its ears, he translated, his voice filled with a quiet pride, will see twice as much. It will be twice as strong. In the months that followed, the Evernite court was transformed. The castle, once a place of rigid, spoken formality, began to fill with the quiet flutter of hands. Conversations happened in dual languages. Arguments were won not by the loudest voice, but by the clearest point, whether spoken or signed. Cale, his ribs mended, was brought out of his dusty exile and appointed royal historian, tasked with restoring the truths that had been erased from their records. The story of Prince Lyran and his sun-singer mate became a cautionary tale taught to every vampire child. Theron and Alara's relationship was not a fairy tale romance. It was a slow, deliberate process of learning and healing. He spent hours with her every day, not as a king, but as a student. She would teach him new signs, her small hands guiding his larger, clumsier ones. He would read ancient poetry to her, his voice a low rumble in the quiet of their chambers, and she would show him how the verses could be translated into the flowing dance of her language. He learned about her wit, her sharp intelligence, her surprising stubbornness. He learned that her silence was not a void, but a space for observation, a place where she saw the small, telling details that everyone else missed. She, in turn, learned about the immense burden of his crown, the loneliness of his long life, and the deep well of regret he carried for his blindness. The bond between them began to mend. The raw, jagged edges softened, knitting together not into the fiery, demanding thing it had once been, but into a quiet, steady hum of connection, a constant, comforting presence at the core of their beings. One evening, nearly a year after the attack in the archives, they were walking in the castle's moon-dusted gardens. The air was cool and smelled of night-blooming jasmine. They walked without speaking, a comfortable silence between them that was more intimate than any conversation. He stopped by a marble bench and took her hand. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Then, using his own fingers, he began to sign against her palm, a private, tactile conversation just for them. I am still learning, he signed into her skin. Every day. To see. To listen. She smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes and made them shine like stars. She turned her hand over and, with her own finger, traced a single, elegant sign onto his palm in reply. Good, she wrote. We have forever. He intertwined his fingers with hers, holding on as if she were his anchor in the vast, dark sea of eternity. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that she was. He had lost his mind watching her thrive without him, only to find the truest part of himself in learning to thrive with her. The king had been saved not by his power, but by his surrender to a quiet, resilient woman who had taught him that the most profound truths are often the ones that are never spoken aloud.